For 60 years, University Technology Mara, or UITM, has been the place for acquiring knowledge and developing capabilities. From a training center to now a vast network of universities, UITM has campuses and faculties all over Malaysia. UITM allows for the pursuing of goals and earning a degree in any field of choice, with a mission to enhance the knowledge and expertise of Bumiputras in all fields of study, through professional programs, research work and community service, while upholding moral values and professional ethics. Nestled amidst the greenery and some of the most scenic areas in the country, each university campus is strategically located in places where their presence inevitably provides an economic boost to the local community. UITM pledges to provide maximum opportunities to pursue professionally recognized programs of study in science, technology, industry, business, arts and humanities. University Technology Mara offers quality education at all levels of study, from foundation to postgraduate. The university has always been at the forefront in science and technology, as well as in management. It is a place where talent, skills and excellence are nurtured. UITM has a mission to empower the indigenous people through the provision of higher education in accordance with Article 153 of the Malaysian Federal Constitution and Act 173, University Technology Mara Act 1976. Duli Yang Maha Mulia, Sri Paduka Baginda Yang di-Pertuan Agong is the Chancellor of UITM by virtue of his status as the King, as provided for by the law.
Aduh, ada background noise ni semuanya. Ada background noise kan? Tak ada. Kak, katanya audio volume too low.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and a very good morning. Yang berbahagia Profesor T.S. Dr. Roziah Chano, Vice Chancellor Universiti Teknologi Mara. Yang berbahagia Profesor Dr. Muhammad Roslan bin Sulaiman, Vice Chancellor Universiti Putra Malaysia, esteemed representative from our co-organizers, colleagues, conference presenters and attendees, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 10th International Conference on University Learning and Teaching, InCULT2021. This biannual conference is jointly organized by Asian Center of Research on University Learning and Teaching, or the short name ACULET, Faculty of Education UITM, Faculty of Educational Studies, University of Malaysia, together with Department of International Affairs, DIA UITM, Office of Global Affairs, Ohio University. Hence, I would like to take this opportunity in welcoming and thanking all our counterparts who have collaborated with us and helped us in making this inaugural online conference a reality. Allow me to begin by commending the organizing team on both the Faculty of Education, UITM, and Faculty of Educational Studies, UPM, for the hard work and commitment, especially in making all the arrangements for the conference without the privilege of having any form of face-to-face meeting. But Alhamdulillah. Challenges, as we all experience. The technological push in the past year has revealed a widening gap in education, among others, and the need to relook at sustaining this sudden change, especially if the scenario is set to stay for a little while longer. As we all despite having to
Warm welcome, and now our long-awaited Vice Chancellor of UITM, who throughout her tenure in leading various departments has advocated for efficient and effective means to achieving our ends, especially if it means embracing what is sustainable. I now invite yang berbahagia Professor T.S. Dr. Hajar Roziah Muhammad Jannah, our brand new Vice Chancellor of UITM, to officially declare InCULT 2021 means open, especially if it means embracing what is sustainable. I now invite yang berbahagia Professor T.S. Dr. Hajar Roziah Muhammad Jannah, our brand new Vice Chancellor of UITM, to officially declare
Distinguished guests, conference presenters, and attendees, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good morning. Welcome everyone to University Technology Mara, UITM. Albeit virtually, I hope one day when the situation has improved, I will have the opportunity to welcome everyone in person, face to face, to this university. I would like to begin by congratulating UITM's Faculty of Education for successfully organizing yet again this prestigious conference. InCULT has had a long history of collaboration between the Faculty of Education, UITM, and Ohio University. And this year, we welcome University Putra Malaysia on board as our co-organizer. Thank you to both Ohio University and University Putra Malaysia for the partnership, and may this partnership be the starting point of more collaboration in the future. This conference takes on the theme Realizing Sustainable Development Goals, SDG, in the new norms through quality education. In these trying times, I personally believe that teaching in the new norm should not be a deterrent to quality education. Academicians should strive for quality education despite the challenges of adapting to these new norms. It is not easy, but it is a journey that must be taken upon by each and every academician to ensure that our education quality is not compromised. The COVID-19 pandemic has taken so much from us, and as the second year of the pandemic draws to a close, the world is moving into an endemic phase. This also calls for a recovery plan, not just for the country's economic landscape, but especially in the landscape of education, which has been significantly impacted due to COVID-19. We need to re-examine, reflect, and take the necessary measures so that no student is left behind during this recovery period. This conference is a congregation of global academicians from around the world. Collectively, the discussion, dialogue, and exchange of opinions and ideas will aid our efforts to realign our educational aims in helping our students to learn better. This year's conference theme also addresses the realization of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, through a quality education. SDG number 4 specifically deals with quality education by ensuring inclusive and equitable education and promoting lifelong learning education for all. As academicians, we must collectively aim to produce learners for the 21st century who are resilient and do not shy away from lifelong learning. Before we can produce such learners, it is pertinent for us to look inward and examine our own practices in teaching. These past 2 years has seen academicians unlearning and relearning teaching pedagogies. As educators, this is what we must do to ensure that we keep up with the changing world. Change is happening and there is no escaping it. With this significant change in the world, it opens up a lot of opportunities for us to investigate, evaluate, assess, reflect on many educational issues. Take this opportunity to engage yourself in educational discourses that will take place during this conference. The impactful publications that come with this conference will also allow more audience to be reached, transcending beyond just the presenters and conference attendees. Before I end my speech, I would like to again congratulate the Faculty of Education, UITM, for another collaborative milestone with Ohio University and University Putra Malaysia. I sincerely hope that I will see more collaboration between the Faculty of Education, UITM, with other higher learning institutions or organizations in the future. The Faculty of Education, UITM, will always have my personal support for each such effort. Ladies and gentlemen, from the bottom of my heart, I wish the organizing committee all the best for today and tomorrow. I pray that conference will go well and will achieve its goals and aspirations.
We would also like to thank our beloved Vice Chancellor for supporting us today and taking the time to welcome our guests and participants of InCULT 2021. I would also like to thank our YouTube participants for joining us today, and perhaps a little gentle reminder to look out for the registration link that will be given after the keynote speech for your attendance and training hours in the chat box by your YouTube moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, as you well know, when we have to deal with online events, we have to share our montage, our experience, and our ideas visually. So I would like to present the montage for InCULT 2021. I wish I had that team help me with my PowerPoint work for my classes. That was fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, we are slightly ahead of schedule, but luckily, technology being what it is, we can straight continue into the next part of the morning session, which is our first keynote speaker. And I am deeply honored to present to you a speaker for whom the term genius actually carries weight. Please welcome this morning's neutron star of a speaker, Emeritus Professor Dr. Keith Tabor from the University of Cambridge, United Kingdom. He is an expert in science education, chemistry education, chemical education, gifted education, and physics education. While working as a teacher, Keith earned a diploma in the practice of science education. His master's degree for research into girls' underrepresentation in physics, and his doctorate for research into conceptual development in chemistry. He joined the Faculty of Education in 1999, where he was involved in initial teacher education, responsible for science and physics in secondary partnership PGCE course.
mental Before I talk about that work in more detail, I need to say something about pedagogy and what is known as constructivism. Constructivism is one of the most referenced notions in educational theory, yet it also means different things to different people, which is perhaps why it is sometimes seen as innovative and progressive, sometimes as simply obvious good practice, but sometimes as dangerously trendy. Of course, the kind of constructivism I favour is the good kind. Constructivism, at least in educational contexts, is in effect a theory of learning. It suggests that learning is an active process located in the learner. This certainly doesn't mean the teacher is superfluous or irrelevant, far from it, but it does mean the best teacher in the world might not be successful if the learner is distracted, uninterested, unprepared, scared, confused, hungry, and so forth. Of course, part of a teacher's role is to motivate and engage learners, but sometimes that may not happen for reasons outside of the teacher's control. Moreover, constructivism suggests that academic learning has particular characteristics. Learning is interpretive, incremental, and iterative. That learning is interpretive means that what the learner understands may not match the teacher's intentions, because what the learner perceives depends upon the teacher's communication being interpreted in terms of the fund of interpretive resources the learner has available. An obvious example is language. A migrant learner that has recently arrived in a country where they do not have the language of instruction at even a basic level will learn little by sitting in lectures and looking at the text in textbooks, no matter how exciting the lecturer or how engaging the text. That much is obvious. But teaching uses examples, analogy, metaphors, and so forth, and these may refer to things outside the learner's experience. Let me give you a simple example. When teaching about sound, a physics teacher may refer to compressions and rarefactions in the air. Now, compression is a common word in English. But what is a rarefaction? It's not common terminology used these days. Francis Bacon wrote a natural history of density and rarity in 1623, but that was somewhat before my time. I do recall that when the Football World Cup was played in Mexico in 1970, there was a lot of commentary about the challenge of playing at altitude due to the rarefied air. When I became a school teacher, I wondered if that might provide a useful cultural reference to help explain the idea of rarefactions. Yet I then realised that I had been 10 years old at the time of that World Cup, so sadly my students would not remember anything about it. Unfortunately, popular cultural references that engage learners, pop stars, soap opera storylines, the latest hit Hollywood film, often have a limited shelf life for use in teaching. There is a concept in education called prerequisite knowledge, what one already needs to know to understand something new. A teacher teaching a topic to 16-year-olds may assume the students will already have learned essential background in earlier grades, at least when that background is set out in the curriculum. In practice, this is not always so. A teacher may have skipped a topic. More often, perhaps, learners may have missed classes, misunderstood, or simply forgotten earlier teaching, in which case new teaching may not be effective if this assumes related anchor points in prior knowledge and they're not there. In science education, we find something even more problematic. Learners often come to class already having their own alternative conceptions of scientific ideas, which may be quite inconsistent with the canonical accounts. And if so, they will tend to misinterpret teaching in terms of their existing understandings. In effect, a teacher's presentation always assumes certain background knowledge. We might suggest in this regard, teachers fall into three categories. Those who are not even aware that their presentation assumes particular background knowledge. Those who are aware of this, but do not think it's an issue because they've been careful to only rely on what learners are supposed to already know. And those who are aware of making an assumption and that they therefore may be wrong, and so seek to check using diagnostic assessment methods. The second characteristic is the incremental nature of learning. Due mainly to the severe limitations of working memory, people can only hold a certain amount of information in mind at any moment. This is an especially limiting factor when the information is or seems to be all novel and unrelated to their existing thinking. By definition, what a teacher, as a subject expert, can cope with at one time is likely to be far beyond most novice learners. So, teaching has to be organised into manageable learning quanta. Only so much new information can be introduced in any class or seminar if we want the learners to take it away from the session. Moreover, permanent memories are laid down sometime after the event. Not everything will be recalled. So important ideas not only need to be emphasised during teaching, but also revisited in successive classes and applied in different contexts if we want learners to master and retain them. We might ask how this relates to that traditional form of university teaching, the lecture, where a teacher spends an hour or however long presenting material to students. What we know about the apparatus of learning and memory in human beings suggests that any lecturer who spends an hour presenting a great deal of new material should not expect the learners to retain much of it. The human brain has simply not evolved to work that way. The best that such a lecturer should expect is that students come out of the sessions with good enough notes that any who then spend considerable time reviewing, reading around, and rewriting those notes will come to learn the intended material. Several hours of follow-up work would then be required for each hour of lecture, which does not sit well with the traditions of science degrees in some contexts, where students have several lectures every morning and are in labs most afternoons, as they simply would not have the time to work up all their lecture notes sufficiently. There are two ways in which a lecturer can give a lecture where the students generally come away with a good understanding of all the essential information. One way is by pitching the work at too low a level. I'm in danger of doing that today. I assume my audience will largely be those teaching in higher education, including many very experienced lecturers. Perhaps you will go away from this presentation today having understood everything and remembering all my key points, simply because I'm telling you nothing new, but just pointing out things that are already obvious to you all. Of course, I do hope you will get some insights from this talk, even if that may mean just making explicit some things your teaching experience has already led you to being tacitly aware of. But if I'm only telling you what you already know only too well, then the talk will be neither challenging nor useful. The other possibility is that the lecturer, being aware of the limitations of human cognition, has arranged a presentation around a modest number of new key ideas and has structured the talk so that these new ideas are supported by material that draws upon the audience members' existing knowledge and understanding, in which it illustrates and exemplify and reiterates these key points. We might say it is that type of approach that allows lecturing to become teaching. Learning is iterative because it's taking place in small steps and is always based on the learner's interpretations of the new in relation to prior learning. Someone who has a bias or misconception will use that as a starting point, and is most likely to interpret new experience in terms of that bias or misconception, and therefore reinforce it. Teachers know what they're teaching, but cannot be sure how it will be perceived by the learners. Now, constructivist teaching is simply teaching that is designed to be effective given these basic features. This probably does mean that such teaching is more likely to be inquiry-focused, learner-centred, dialogic and so forth. But it does not mean, as has been wrongly suggested, that there is minimal guidance from the teacher. For although it does mean that standing up and talking for an hour, giving a presentation dense with new ideas and details, is not likely to be useful, it doesn't mean the teacher does not try to teach their subject, but rather they appreciate teaching involves more than telling. In schools, this may be straightforward. The teacher may present some basic ideas for 10 minutes, then set the students a structured activity perhaps initially individually, then in groups. And then the teacher may lead a review exploring students' responses and guiding them towards the canonical account. Then there may be another activity which is designed to reinforce those key points that the teacher has highlighted in the class discussion, followed by some related homework. In a school classroom then, frequent shifts in activity between the teacher leading classroom dialogue and a range of other forms of organisation is often the norm. Perhaps that is how many university teachers also work, even if most university lecture halls are not designed to facilitate such shifts. But that is some way from the standard lecture, where students, often today sadly seen as customers or clients, often expect the teacher to spend the time communicating their expertise. Expectations and student perceptions of what a teacher job involves may pressure the university teacher into doing all the talking, presenting for long periods, even though that is not good pedagogy. As has often been recognised, if a lecture is just about passing on lecture notes, there are much cheaper approaches. Indeed, nowadays, the notes could be transferred digitally in a way that avoids the need for the university to provide and heat lecture halls, allows a lecturer to get on with their research, and lets the students stay in bed for another hour, which all parties may welcome. Of course, that is a caricature, and some lectures can be engaging, exciting, and funny. But a lecture which is good entertainment and is enjoyed by students does not ensure the students come away having understood and committed everything to memory. I should point out my science bias is relevant here. In many disciplines, much teaching is done by seminars and the like. But when I went to Cambridge, the standard term for most class sessions was lecture. And indeed, the university published a lecture list setting out all the courses being taught. Universities are different. Of course, there is an argument that the limitations on human learning we find in school teaching should not be applied in a university. After all, adults are not children. They have longer concentration spans. Undergraduates, and especially graduates, are more intelligent and mature than the typical school learner, and so can be expected to be more effective learners than children or adolescents. Undergraduates, and especially graduates, have highly developed metacognition, and so can monitor and manage their own learning much better than school-age learners. University students, such as teachers in preparation, are highly motivated, as their learning material likely to be highly relevant to personal goals, which may not always be true of school learners. These are fair and important points, but in terms of the basic cognitive apparatus available to learners, the differences between school children and university students are a matter of degree, not kind. When I first went to Cambridge, most of my input related to the postgraduate certificate in education programs, which offered one-year courses in certified teacher preparation for graduates. I had various inputs into these courses at different times, but the main two roles I took on related to subject-specific provision. There are various ideas one seeks to get across to those entering teaching. One aspect is the interactive nature of teaching. A good teacher knows about their subject, as has prepared well for the topics being taught. They also have knowledge about the curriculum, means of assessment, good pedagogy, and so forth. But they also know about their students. No two classes are alike, even when they are supposedly equivalent, and every learner is unique. Teaching is a kind of relating. As the old joke goes, what do you do for a living? I'm a teacher. Oh, what do you teach? Students. Another key point to get across to new teachers, especially recent graduates who may have become acclimatized to studying through attending lectures, is that an attempt to give a lecture to a typical school class will likely be a disaster. Attention spans are short, and the students will lose concentration, motivation, and in some case, any sense of duty to respect someone who simply talked to them for long periods. I knew full well that as a teacher, there can be an imperative to be the one in the classroom doing and talking, even when you know that learners will learn more when they're actively engaged with materials rather than just being asked to listen. at least when those student activities are well designed and suitably structured. But if I, as an education lecturer, am telling students as teachers they have to make sure it's the learners who are doing most of the doing in the classroom, I should set an example. Otherwise, I would seem to be saying, do as I tell you and not as I do. One of our PGCE programs was known as the middle school course. Because of the nature of the English school curriculum and the government's policies about teacher qualification, the students on this course had to specialise in one of the three core curriculum subjects, English, mathematics or science, as well as be able to teach across a range of the subjects for the younger students. I took on the role of teaching the subject specialist course for those students who were science specialists. These would have all been graduates with a science background, but from a wide range of differing degree courses. In first meeting this group each year, I wanted to engage the students in an activity that would set the tone for the rest of the course. It's common when a group first meets to engage in some kind of ice-breaking activity to allow students to get to know each other. I decided I would not just ask students to say a little about themselves, but also ask each student to make a brief, unprepared presentation to the group. Perhaps to appreciate this activity, it's useful to know about a conceit that has been part of government assumptions underpinning graduate teacher education in England for some years. This is the assumption that even though teachers are expected to have good subject knowledge, the teacher preparation courses are not expected to include any time to teach any science. As these students were science graduates, they were expected to already know the science, and the course was to help them to find out how to teach it. Now that logic suggests a considerable level of ignorance of education, or a high level of contempt in ignoring the actual situation. As discussed earlier, we should never assume someone knows something just because they're supposed to have already been taught it. Moreover, the level at which science is represented, modelled in school curriculum, is not that at which it is studied on degree courses. Furthermore, learning for teaching requires a much deeper engagement than learning to pass an exam. As if that was not enough, the students were expected to be able to teach across all science curriculum topics, regardless of whether their own degree was in mechanical engineering, genetics, psychology, industrial chemistry, electronics, or whatever. So, to my activity. I would take with me to the class a lucky dip box, which contained cards on which were printed terms which occurred in the science curriculum. Each member of the class would have to present for just a couple of minutes on a science topic drawn by chance without any time to prepare. Now, it may seem this was a little cruel, and perhaps was a good way to mortify anyone feeling underprepared for the course, such as, say, the physics graduate who might draw a card labelled xylem. Yet the task actually went well, and students seemed to genuinely enjoy the activity. I think this is because of the rules of the game. I would ask for a volunteer to speak first, to introduce themselves and present a topic drawn from the box. That student would draw their topic and reveal it to the class, but then they would have a choice. They could proceed with the talk, or they could decide to defer their turn till later, when they could have another attempt at the lucky dip, but only as long as someone else in the class would volunteer to take their place. So a hypothetical physicist, who may not remember ever having heard the term xylem, could offer this topic to the class, and someone with a biology background was likely to opt to take this on, rather than risk themselves later drawing a topic they knew little about. I know the activity produced engagement, fun, and some laughter. I think it also produced some important learning about how teachers cannot be expected to know everything, how it's important to prepare well for class rather than work on the hoof, and in particular, the value to teachers and student teachers of that incredible resource they should not be afraid to tap into, their peers. At the end of the first meeting of the class, there was a group of people who had already started supporting each other on the course. One of my other roles was as the physics education specialist, working with graduates who would become secondary science teachers with a physics specialism. One day a week when in faculty, the students worked in their specialist subject groups. And I arranged the programme so that each time the class met, we considered a different physics topic. But I would feed in material on generic issues into the different topics. At that time, there was less talk about so-called flipped learning, which has become much more common since. The idea of flipped learning is that rather than class sessions being primarily about information transfer from teacher to student, with students left to consolidate and apply learning after class, it's better to set pre-session work to enable students to familiarise themselves with the ideas of a topic, and then class time is spent on applying those ideas under teacher supervision. That is, of course, a rather minimal description, but I imagine many of those in this audience are already very familiar with this notion, which has had a lot of attention in higher education teaching. Whilst I would prepare material for each topic, I would also set the students' preparatory work working in groups. We encourage teachers to use group work with their classes. A key reason for this is to facilitate dialogue that can support student learning when learners engage in discussing ideas with peers at similar levels of knowledge and understanding. When working in a group, one is encouraged to make one's thinking explicit and to justify it, and to open that thinking to critique. Group work relies upon and can develop interpersonal skills and can encourage aspects of metacognition such as planning, monitoring, and evaluating progress on a task. Our graduate students should be well advanced in such matters, but in becoming teachers, it's important that much implicit knowledge they have acquired as successful learners is made explicit and reflected upon. In Vygotskian terms, group tasks can encourage working in the ZPD, the zone of proximal development. And what is made explicit in the interpersonal or social plane will become explicit too in the intrapersonal or mental plane. So I would organise students into small groups and set them a task for the following session. Importantly, the task was preparing to present to the wider group. So as in constructionist approaches to learning, the students were developing a product for public consumption. Perhaps next week's session is on heating or electricity or nuclear physics. Different groups could be given different foci, researching common student conceptions and learning difficulties, relevant laboratory practical work, mapping out the content included in the upper secondary and advanced level curriculum, researching useful teaching resources for the topic, and so on. Groups would be asked to take on different foci for different sessions. In this way, the students in their groups took over the teaching of aspects of the topic to their peers. This then modelled something we would be encouraging them to do in their own teaching when they went on school placements. Of course, the teacher may delegate tasks, but remains the person responsible for the class. As the tutor, I not only observed these inputs, but acted as inquisitor, provocateur, supplementary source of information, corrector, evaluator. Thus, I not only modelled the use of learner-focused learning activities, but also how the teacher has to moderate such activities and retain overall direction of the process. One of the key ideas new teachers have to learn is how students may come along to class with missing, incomplete, or distorted prior learning. And this only becomes clear if the students are given scope to express their thinking. This applied just as much with my graduate class as with their own students in the schools. Similarly, we impress upon new teachers that just because you've taught something clearly and accurately, you cannot assume students will have learnt it without revisiting the ideas later in new contexts and giving them opportunities to work with the ideas. This applies at any level. My graduates will have found us returning to the same principles in new contexts, with my eliciting their application of key ideas, feeding back on their use of these ideas, and modelling how we apply them in teaching. It was also possible to model the use of some teaching techniques that can apply across levels. So, for example, asking learners to take full notes in a class can use a lot of time and put a lot of effort into the mechanical activity of copying what is being presented. Yet providing handouts with the full notes risks students not feeling a need to engage with the notes during the class. Ideally, we want student activity, mental activity, that is an effective use of time. Indeed, ideally, we want tasks set in the student's ZPD, where they are facing a challenge, but one which they can master with the support provided. In schools, one approach is to use DARTs, directed activities related to text. This may mean providing text subjected to modified close procedures, such as blanking some words, with or without a provided list of the missing words, or only showing the initial letter of some words. Students have to actively engage to identify the correct words to enter into the blanks to complete the notes. This takes time, but that time is largely spent thinking, not mechanically copying. The difficulty of the task can be differentiated depending on the number and choice of omissions made. In the original closed procedure, to assess reading levels, every nth word is removed from a text on some familiar topic. In the modified version for teaching, omissions are made more strategically. For example, blanking words that can be deduced from the rest of the provided text, but only with careful reading. Other activities that may be used include providing diagrams or graphs with missing labels to be completed by reading an associated piece of text. Alternatively, providing a diagram with labels that can help learners identify words missing from a text. Another example will be to provide learners with instructions for some activity, but with those instructions broken up and presented out of sequence, so that the learners have to think about and understand the process they've been asked to follow in order to reorder the sequence correctly. Activities such as these can be adapted to any level of learner, and by using these kinds of activities with the student teachers, they could appreciate the learner experience and logic of the approach, rather than simply being told this is something they could use in their own teaching. So again, it was possible to model teaching approaches rather than simply recommend them. The graduates on the teacher preparation course had the common aim of qualifying to teach in UK schools, and generally appreciated how the course aim, structure and content were aligned with the national standards for new teachers. My other main area of university teaching was somewhat different in that regard. My teaching of research methods was also largely to graduate groups, but of quite different nature. Of course, graduate students at a top university will tend to be intelligent, hardworking, and highly motivated, so I'm certainly not suggesting these were difficult groups to teach. Far from it. It was a real privilege to have been able to work with both these categories of students. However, the context was very different. For one thing, these were mostly international students, and Cambridge attracts students from all around the world. That provided a good education for me. Students had very different backgrounds, norms, and expectations. So, for example, a student from one country would expect to call a teacher by their first name on first meeting, whereas a student from another country might feel it's appropriate to still call you professor, even after working closely with you for years, perhaps at best graduating from Professor Tabor to Professor Keith. Expectations about what happens in the lecture room can vary significantly, especially in relation to being asked to make public contributions and being invited to critique and even disagree with what other students or the professor presents. Moreover, education attracts students with backgrounds from across the disciplines: arts, humanities, social and natural sciences. Many of these have teaching experience or aspirations, but by no means all. Many of our students were interested in policy issues, or saw educational settings as the focus of research that was historical, sociological, psychological, economic, or philosophical. Some of our students were primarily interested in issues of global development or equity, rather than with teaching and learning. I taught on the educational research course, which was intended to prepare students for doctoral work across education, as well as on the core methods component of various themed courses. In those core courses, students were mixed from across the wide range of master's courses offered. Many of our students were undertaking empirical research of one form or another, but some were doing library-based research, and some were doing philosophical or literary analysis. This presented two issues for those teaching on these courses. The first is the diversity of backgrounds. Whilst this offers an immense and valuable resource within the cohort, going back to my point about how a group of students bring an incredible fund of experiences and knowledge which could potentially be shared, it also made it very difficult to assume any common background. All the students were graduates, but there was no set of concepts, paradigms, perspectives, or even technical terms that would be common to them all. Any particular aspect of the course content was likely to be extremely familiar to those with a certain disciplinary background, but completely novel to others in the class. The second issue concerned relevance. On a taught course, it's possible to design an examination that has questions reflecting all the lectures, making all the sessions seem potentially relevant to the students. On a course where assessment is by evaluating outcomes of a personal research project, it's obvious to students that not all of the sessions are directly relevant to their own project. Our philosophy had been that students should be prepared to engage with, that is, at least read critically, research from across the educational spectrum. Some students bought into that and were always genuinely grateful for being taught something new, even if they could see it was not something they'll be applying in their current project. Other students, understandably, felt they could find more targeted use for their time than being in some classes, reflecting that at the end of the day, it was the quality of their thesis which would be graded, which may be critical in getting that dream position they were working towards. This was an inherent structural issue that was only in part addressed by offering some degree of electives on the course. A student who was a counsellor practitioner may feel that they only wanted to focus on the traditional inquiry approaches accepted in their professional area. Students working on literary sources may see little point in learning about fieldwork methods. Some from arts education may have no interest in learning about quantitative approaches, while someone doing psychological research following experimental paradigms might not see the relevance of learning about interpretivist approaches. I could not solve that problem as a teacher assigned to a range of topics to lecture on, but I could do two things, neither of which I expect will strike the audience today as earth-shattering. The first point was to apply my knowledge of how we advise school teachers to my own teaching. The sessions were usually 2 hours or sometimes 90 minutes, but some sessions were 4 hours. Clearly, structuring sessions with changes of activity was essential. Even where a session was largely a lecture, it was important to build in points where the lecturer stopped talking and students were asked to undertake some individual or small group activity to either reinforce what they had just heard or to act as advanced organisers for what was to come later. For example, students were asked to see if they could work in small groups to match the terms and descriptions of key principles in personal construct theory as an introductory activity before the theory was taught. They were aware I was not assuming they would know this before being taught, but this activity engaged thinking about the terms and primed their attention when I revealed the answers. I also drew on the research in science education that reminds teachers that students may come to class with alternative conceptions of concepts or terms, or with ideas which will lead to them misinterpreting new ideas they meet, and that novel ideas are seldom acquired and later recalled accurately after one presentation, and that ideas which seem fairly simple and straightforward to someone familiar with them, such as a teacher, can often seem complex and extensive to someone meeting them for the first time. In particular, I sought to draw on a number of basic pedagogic principles that featured in my own writing for teachers. This example relates to a pre-class activity that asked students to think about their own project in relation to pairs of contrasting statements that were related to a model that was later built up in the following class. Given the limited capacity of human working memory, whatever is novel in a session should be introduced sparingly and incrementally in manageable learning quanta. Related to this, key new ideas introduced in one lecture should be revisited and applied in later sessions to reinforce and support consolidation. And the new technical vocabulary associated with these ideas should be modelled frequently so that the terms and the ways in which they are used become habitual. Related to this, key new ideas introduced in one lecture should be revisited and applied in later sessions to reinforce and support consolidation. And the new technical vocabulary associated with these ideas should be modelled frequently so that the terms and the ways in which they are used become habitual. A key issue was to do what I could to make sessions relevant to as many of the students as possible. Time only allows a couple of examples to illustrate this. One technique I used a lot was to introduce an idea, principle or model in teaching and ask the students to apply this to published research. In preparation, I would ask students to select and briefly review 2 or 3 studies before the class and bring copies of the studies with them to class. There might be some criteria. Often these needed to be empirical studies with a detailed account of the research design and methodology applied. However, I would tell students they were welcome to bring examples of studies that they had access to read for their own projects, or to look for research on anything that interested them. In this way, even if the examples I used in class to introduce and exemplify a principle did not seem of particular interest to some in the class, they would then be applying the ideas in the context of research that was relevant and interesting to them. When teaching about methodologies such as action research, grounded theory, or case study, I would circulate titles of a large number of diverse studies claiming to use that approach, and ask students to select 2 or 3 from that list, or if they preferred, seek out their own examples. Of course, even when teaching about research, not everything can be taught through working with reports of published studies. So, when I devised other activities for use in class, I would use course-wide ideas as examples and subject matter as foci for the activities. As an example, in teaching about Kelly's triads and the construct repertory test, a data collection technique that uses a kind of card sorting process, For one activity, I'd provide cards with terms taken from the research course itself, so that in sorting the cards, the students were required to think about key course ideas, making the focus of the activity, if not its nature, relevant to all members of the class. When I first taught the session on qualitative data analysis, this was alongside a colleague who used for an activity some anonymised data from a real research project. This gives an authentic activity, but one where considerable time has to be spent introducing students to the purpose and nature of the project and the logic of the specific coding being applied, when the project itself was only directly relevant to the research of a small minority of the class. When I took on the sessions by myself, I compiled a set of published interviews with researchers from a wide range of backgrounds and approaches to be treated as the data to be analysed, pointing out that this wasn't really raw data, as we had no knowledge of how the interviews had been transcribed and edited, but we could treat it as if data for the purposes of the exercise. Students could select an example they saw as most relevant or interesting. The class then sought to analyse the data in two different approaches, one of which used codes I provided based on key concepts from the research course. Again, the purpose was to find some common ground in the activity, such that even those course members who were never going to use any qualitative methods of data analysis in their own research could appreciate that this was an activity asking them to apply the concepts they were learning on the course. As I mentioned above, it may be that I've just told you what you already knew, that I have, as that rather odd idiom goes, only be teaching grandmothers to suck eggs. However, I do hope I've offered some ideas, principles, examples that may be useful, perhaps drawing on your knowledge of teaching in higher education and helping making some of your tacit knowledge more explicit. I came into higher education having already been formed as a teacher working in schools and further education, and initially as someone being asked to use that experience to support the learning of new teachers. Therefore, even though it was clearly obvious to me how teaching in university, and especially on graduate courses, was in some ways very different to teaching in a school, I was also motivated to reflect deeply on how the principles that apply in school teaching also apply in teaching other groups of learners as well, and how those same principles could inform teaching different content to very different groups. My teaching of educational research methods presented a very different challenge to teaching chemistry and physics to children. But my experience of using pedagogy in the school classroom, and then modelling some of those techniques in graduate teacher education, provided background experiences I was able to apply to this new context. Those of us who come into university teaching as trained and experienced school teachers are lucky to have that background and fund of experience to draw upon. I know most university teachers do not follow this route, and indeed sometimes receive limited support in learning about pedagogy when they start teaching in the university sector. I hope, therefore, that some of what I've shared today may make useful material for others to reflect on. Thank you very much.
My brains hurt. On behalf of the organizers, participants, and everyone still in awe over here, thank you, Emeritus Professor Dr. Keith Tabor, Professor of Science Education, University of Cambridge. As mentioned earlier, unfortunately, he will not be taking questions. So we will be adjourning here shortly for this morning until 11 a.m. when Professor Kelly SQ takes center stage. Thank you again to our YouTube participants for joining us. And just one more gentle reminder to look out for the registration link given in the chat box by your YouTube moderator for your attendance and training hours. True to us being educational people, we have a chance to try out and apply the principles Professor Tabor spoke about just now. So please stick around with our physical education students under the supervision of Encik Ahmad Fahim, who have put together these brain gym activities right after this. And we hope you have fun joining in. Thank you and enjoy your break, everyone. And hopefully, you will all be fresh and ready for the second keynote speech at 11 here. Take it away. Yes.
Mana dia?